Hi everyone, my name is Natalia Gavlin and today's video is about asylum interview. I have recorded a video before just giving you a little bit of a floor plan when it comes to asylum, what the rules are, how to apply. And right now I just want to bring you to the point of you have an appointment with an asylum officer at the asylum office. What do you do? So number one step, of course, is to prepare all the required documents. Go over your story and prepare with your attorney question and answer so that you have no surprises. I usually walk my clients through every single step of that interview. From the moment you enter through the doors to the time you exit, I want you to have absolutely no surprises. I want you to know what to expect every step of the way. So let's start. You will come to asylum office at the time designated, and you need to bring with you 2 sets of documents for the officer, and of course a set of the originals. The officer does not take the original documents from you, they will simply review them and give it back to you. Obviously you want to have a copy for yourself. So once you check in, you will be assigned a number, at least that's the system in New York City, and you have to wait to take biometrics. After that, it starts a very nice process of just waiting. So you wait and wait and wait, and then finally an officer will call you. So what to expect once the officer will call you? Well, it starts simply. They will take a passport, they will make a copy of it, they take it to the room, and then they just tell you the purpose of the interview, whether you have an interpreter, if you have an attorney, whether you understand why you're here, just the basics. They have a script, they read it to you, you basically just sit and nod and say, yes, I understand. Then starts the questioning. Now here you have to be careful. The asylum interview is broken into 2 parts. Well, I should say 3 parts technically. First part is they go over pages 1 through 4 of your asylum application from I-589. So they will go with you where you were born, what your religion is, when you arrived, your address history, all the information about your family members, siblings, parents, all of that. You talk about it, and if there are any inconsistencies between what you say and what's written in your application, the officer will make corrections and they will number them. Because at the end of the interview, you will sign page 10 that says that certain number of corrections were made to your application at the interview. So that's part 1. After that, part 2 consists of the officer actually going into the details of your asylum case. So they will go over your story and they will ask you questions. Now, there are 2 questions that I guarantee you will hear. There are going to be a bunch of others that I can estimate, but there are going to be definitely 2 that I guarantee you will hear. One is, why are you applying for asylum? It could be phrased as why you're applying for asylum or why you left your country, depending on the circumstances, but the point is the same. Now, as I tell my clients, this is the moment where you have to tell the officer a little preview of what this case is about. I don't like answers like, I didn't like it in my country. I wasn't treated well. No, you're not saying anything. You have to think about it. You have to write it down if needed. This is the moment where you think of it like selling your case. You have to tell the officer shortly what happened to you. And then at the end, question number 2, I guarantee you will hear it, is what do you think will happen to you if you are sent back to your country? You will hear it. Again, a small detailed statement is required from you. Basically, you have to just summarize everything you've been saying and say, for all these reasons, I am afraid to return back. Those are the 2 questions I can guarantee you will hear. There are obviously a lot of other questions. The officers don't always follow your statement. So if you prepare for your interview in the order in which the statement is written, you might be surprised, and sometimes unpleasantly, when the officer turns the whole thing upside down and they start questioning you from the back of your story. Now, some people are not good with dates, some people are not good with names. When that happens to them under those stressful conditions, they freak out. They don't know how to handle it. So I recommend when you're preparing for your asylum interview, you go over your statement back and forth and sideways and of every possible way, so that if there's a question asked, not in the order how your statement is written, you are not surprised. You say, okay, I expected that. I can answer this question. Now that I will go more a little into the details of that. But the third part of the asylum interview possibly the easiest, of course, depending on your case, is what I call the bar questions. They're simply yes or no questions that will ask you about your involvement in political parties, terrorism, all these sorts of, they're called bar questions because most of the time, if the answer is yes to any of them, you might be triggering bar to asylum, meaning you might not be granted asylum because they will say things like, have you been a member of a Nazi party? Have you been a member of a terrorist party? Obviously, you know, have you been arrested? Have you had criminal records? Again, arrest question is very careful. A lot of the time, people are so used to saying no because they feel like everything has to be a no, that when the arrest question is asked, they automatically say no. Meanwhile, in their statement, in their story, they have explained all these situations where they have been arrested on account of their political opinion, religious affiliation, etc. And then when the question is asked again during the bar questions format, people automatically say no. Meanwhile, that was the point of your whole entire case, so you have to be very careful about how to answer those questions. Now, just like with any other immigration interview, asylum interview involves a lot of personal aspects, a lot of personal factors. You do not know who your interviewing officer will be that day. You don't know what kind of day they will be having. You don't know what country they're from and what their views are about certain things. I mean, I've been doing this for a very long time. I have appeared to so many asylum interviews, green card interviews, and very often, I mean, besides the fact that I know a lot of officers, a lot of the time when I see someone, I can read them and I already know, okay, this is going to be an interesting case, or this is going to be good, this is going to be fun, the officer is coming off as very pleasant. But even if someone is coming off as pleasant and nice, that does not mean that you should confuse yourself into thinking that they're on your side. They're not on your side. Not to say they're against you, but they're not on your side. They're there to do their job. And what their job is to evaluate the facts before them, to evaluate the documents, narrow down any inconsistencies, any omissions, anything that's off between your testimony and the documents, and possibly use it against you in denying your case. Again, I'm using the word denying. They're not really in a position to deny because they're immigration officers, but not grant, I guess, should be a better term. So a lot of the time, obviously, people are nervous. And of course, unlike a marriage case, when you're dealing with an asylum case, we're dealing with incredibly personal stories. We're talking about terrible instances of harm being done to people. And of course, when you combine that with a stressful situation of being interrogated, with being questioned, with being put into a situation you're not used to, it can get really bad really quick. So my thing is, highly recommend preparation. I highly recommend reading your story, but do not memorize it. Because like I said, if the question is asked from a different angle, you might not be able to answer it properly. You have to speak to someone. If you're represented by an attorney, I hope your attorney is doing a good job preparing you for it. But if you're not represented by an attorney because you decided to do it on your own, speak to someone anyway. I don't know if there's a person you can trust, but try to explain your story to someone. Try to say it so that you get in a habit of talking about the bad situations that happened to you in the past. Now, I don't mean to minimize it by saying the word bad situation. We're talking about persecution. Persecution is a really bad thing. Although there is no definition for what persecution is exactly under the law, there are certain cases that let the officer or the judge understand whether or not this set of facts constitutes persecution. Persecution can involve a lot of forms. It can be harassment coupled with physical violence, could be mental stress, could be mistreatment, can be detention, interrogation, bullying. I mean, obviously by itself, each of those things will not be persecution, but a combination of those on account of the 5 protected groups will amount to persecution. And since you're dealing with immigration officers, and by no means I want to say anything bad about immigration officers, but they're not judges, and oftentimes they're not even attorneys. So they do not have, in my opinion, again, not to say anything about them, they do not have as deep of an understanding of what the legal standard for asylum is. I have had cases where I will argue my client's case during my closing statement, which I always give, and the officer will question me back and say, well, you're saying this, what's the basis for it? And I would just look at them and say, this is the case law in Second Circuit, which is in New York. And I've had situations where the officer would ask me to email it to them or to fax it to them. So I would get back to my office and I would pull up the case law and I would send it back to the officer and say, this is the case that says that these fact patterns fit within persecution, and this is similar to my client's case. And because we have that exchange, these cases get approved. Because sometimes, I don't mean to say we educate the officers, but in a way we do. If you are a zealous advocate and you're there to represent your client's interests, you have to teach people sometimes what it is to be an asylee from a particular country. Sometimes it's an issue of cultural factors. Although they see clients, I guess, from all over the place, all over the world, sometimes they don't understand the nuances involved in certain cultures. So they try to use it against a person. So in that case, what we do, again, is we explain to the officer, this is a cultural thing. For example, this is very interesting, but in Chinese and Mandarin, there is no difference between a plural and a singular. So if someone says a cat or cats, it's the same word. And you'll be surprised how many times they will say, well, you said a cat, now you're saying cats. Which is it? Was it one or was it three? Why are you changing your testimony? And it's like, I'm not changing my testimony. I used the word that the interpreter translated one way, although it could have been translated the other way. I mean, these are just slight cultural differences that need to be explained to the officer, and you have to be prepared to do so. So if you notice that the officer is confused, sometimes it's important to step back and say, I see you're confused. You probably misunderstood something I said. Let me try to explain this to you. Because, again, cultural fact, but let's say in Ukraine or in Russia, you could live on the same street. Meanwhile, your houses are not going to be in line. One could be half a town across and it's still the same street, and they wouldn't understand. And they would use it against you to say, well, you live on the same street with this person. The name is the same on the letter. Meanwhile, you're saying they're like 5 miles away. What's going on? You have to explain these sorts of things. Again, cultural factors, if you do these cases, you see what's happening and you need to be prepared for these sorts of things. So, that being said, part 1, going over the asylum form. Part 2, speaking about your case, your statement, your details. And part 3, the bar questions, which you have to be careful about. At the end of the interview, they will ask you to come back for a decision. Lately, they're telling people they will mail it, so people do not have to return. But that is basically what to expect from an asylum interview.